The purchase. I didn't set out to buy a barn that morning. I just wanted fence nails and a coffee. But when I passed Mr. Carter's place, the for sale sign lay face down in the ditch and the paint on his abandoned barn flaked like old sunburn. I pulled over, curiosity doing the steering. Mr. Carter shuffled onto the porch in his socks. He's the kind of neighbor who speaks in discounts and shrugs. "Make me an offer," he said, staring past me at the leaning roofline. 1,000, I said, mostly to hear the number cross the air. He snorted. 1,200 and it's yours. Barn, lot, and whatever ghosts live in there. I shook his hand before my brain could list reasons not to. The deed was scribbled at his kitchen table, between a jar of bolts and a single slice of white bread. 10 minutes later, I had keys and a barn I'd never inspected. It wasn't much to look at. The siding was gray and soft, like wet cardboard. Vines gripped the walls with jealous fingers. Inside, dust lay thick as felt, swallowing the light in gulps. A ladder trembled up to a loft. Mice announced squatters' rights from the rafters. Still, I felt that tug you get when something broken wants you. I walked the perimeter, boot soles crunching on old nails and cherry pits. Out back, the ground mounded oddly near the far fence, a blister on the earth big enough to trip a tractor. The grass there grew darker, thicker, as if fed by a secret. Wind pushed through the slats and made the whole building breathe. I stood over that rise in the soil and thought, someone dug here once. Maybe they meant for me to notice. First light, first shovel. I came back at sunrise with gloves, a spade, and the old metal detector I borrow whenever lost screws become emergencies. Dew jeweled the weeds around the barn, and the boards clicked as they settled, like a horse shifting in sleep. I walked the perimeter slow, letting the detector hum its thin mosquito song while I memorized the ground, the way you memorize a face. The mound by the fence pulled at me again. Up close, it wasn't just raised earth. It was a careful swell, a wheelbarrow's worth of soil softened and spread. Someone had tamped it with the flat of a shovel long ago. I pushed the detector over it. The tone sharpened, bright and insistent, then fell off, then rose again near the center. I scraped back the grass with the spade, rolling the sod like a rug. The smell came first, cool mineral, a cellar scent, as if the ground were exhaling. 6 inches down, the blade clinked. I paused, listened, and cut a square trench, neat and measured, the way my father taught me when we buried fence posts. Under the loam lay stones, river-rounded, arranged in a tight oval, a beadwork of gray and tan. It wasn't random. It was a boundary, a message in a language of rocks. I lifted 2, then 3. The detector squealed at the exposed center. I switched to my hands. The soil there was finer, sifted once, sifted again. My fingers closed on something that wasn't stone, wood, smooth and aged, edges softened by time. I cleared until corners emerged, then a lid line, then an iron hasp rusted to the color of dried blood. A box, small, deliberate, asleep in the earth. I brushed it clean, then stopped, the morning quiet. The box was smaller than a bread loaf, built from some dark wood that smelled faintly of cedar and damp soil. Its iron hasp was fused shut by rust, but the wood itself was firm, not the kind that collapses at a touch. I ran my fingers along its sides, brushing away bits of clay, and noticed faint etchings, shallow grooves carved by a pocket knife or nail. Not words, exactly, more like symbols, looping and intersecting like someone's private shorthand. I wedged the spade under the lid and gave a gentle twist. The hasp cracked with a sharp snap that startled a flock of birds from the nearby fence line. Slowly, I pried it open. Inside, instead of the gold coins or brittle letters part of me had hoped for, lay glass jars. 3 of them, packed tightly and cushioned by folded canvas. Each jar was sealed with wax, their contents murky and indistinct in the morning light. One held what looked like rolled papers, another a strange collection of dark metal pieces like broken watch parts, and the third, something pale and fibrous, floating in yellowed liquid. I lifted the paper-filled jar carefully. It was heavier than it looked. Through the cloudy glass, I could make out layers of parchment, maybe maps or documents, tightly wound. Whoever buried this hadn't wanted the contents destroyed by time. As I set the jar down, I noticed the bottom of the box bore a faint stain, like oil or something older, seeping through the grain. Beneath it, the dirt was looser, as if the box had been placed atop something else. I knelt back on my heels, heart beating faster. I'd found something, but the real secret, I suspected, still waited beneath my boots. I moved the box aside carefully, setting it on a folded tarp so the damp ground wouldn't damage it further. The earth beneath was soft, almost spongy, like someone had disturbed it not just once but several times over the years. I pressed the spade in and began to dig, slow and deliberate, peeling back the layers of soil as if opening a letter sealed decades ago. About a foot down, the blade struck something solid with a hollow, resonant thunk. I froze. It wasn't stone. The sound had that unmistakable echo of wood against metal. I widened the hole, scraping away dirt with my gloved hands until the outline of a rectangular shape emerged. Larger than the first box, maybe 3 feet long and 2 wide. The top was covered with a layer of rotted burlap, which disintegrated when I brushed it. Beneath, a wooden lid sat flush against a metal frame. Whoever buried this had built it to last. My pulse quickened. I leaned closer, running my fingers along the edges until I found a latch crusted with rust and earth. It looked fragile, but when I tugged, it held firm. I fetched a crowbar from the truck and wedged it under the edge. The lid resisted at first, groaning as if complaining about being disturbed after so long. Then, with a sharp crack, it lifted slightly. A stale rush of air escaped, dry, old, carrying a faint scent of oil, paper, and something metallic. I pried it open fully and directed my flashlight inside. At first, all I saw was darkness swallowing the beam. Then shapes began to emerge, stacked tins, bundled cloth, and what looked like a leather satchel resting against one side. Whatever this was, it wasn't just junk someone tossed away. It was hidden on purpose. The leather satchel was wedged tightly against the side of the larger box, its strap curled like a sleeping snake. I reached in carefully, brushing away layers of fine dirt and dried roots that had crept in over the years. The leather was stiff but intact, the brass buckle tarnished green with age. When I unfastened it, a puff of musty air escaped, like opening an old trunk in an attic. Inside were papers, dozens of them, folded, stacked, and tied with a brittle cord that snapped as soon as I pulled. Some were handwritten notes in a looping script I didn't recognize. Others were typed pages yellowed with time. There were faded maps, too, drawn with ink that bled into the paper fibers, showing sections of land with unfamiliar markings and annotations in the margins. Near the bottom of the satchel, tucked between 2 folded envelopes, I found a small, leather-bound notebook. Its cover was cracked, and the initials J.R. Ben were embossed faintly in gold. I flipped it open, careful not to tear the fragile pages. The first entry began with a date, June 3rd, 1949. "I don't trust the men from town," it read. "They say it's progress, but I can feel it. They're hiding something beneath this ground. I'll keep my own record just in case." My breath caught. This wasn't just random junk. This was someone's personal account of something they believed was happening here. I read a few more lines. The writer mentioned late-night digging near the property line, trucks with covered loads arriving after dark, and strange machinery sounds echoing through the fields. I closed the notebook slowly. The barn, the boxes, the satchel. It all fit together like a puzzle I hadn't realized I was solving. I spent the rest of that morning sitting cross-legged beside the open pit, carefully sorting through the papers I'd pulled from the satchel. The handwriting shifted between hurried scrawls and precise block letters, as if the author switched moods mid-sentence. Some pages were diary entries, others looked more like observation logs. Dates spanned several years, all between the late 1940s and mid-1950s. The recurring theme was unmistakable: activity at night, men working near the creek, strange shipments arriving from the rail yard, and the sound of engines beneath the soil when the fields should have been silent. One entry chilled me more than the rest. Dated October 12, 1951, it read, "I saw them again. Lanterns by the barn moving in a line. They're digging towards something. I don't think Carter knows what's under his own land." Carter. That name snapped me back to the present. Mr. Carter, my neighbor, the man who sold me this place for $1,200 without even stepping off his porch. Could his family have known? Or worse, had they chosen to forget? I folded the papers neatly, tucking them back into the satchel. Then I walked the perimeter of the barn slowly, flashlight in hand even though the sun was high. Every creak of wood and scuttle of mice felt amplified. I noticed something new: faint depressions in the soil near the far corner, like the ground had been disturbed more recently than the rest. I knelt, ran my hand over the uneven earth, and felt the unmistakable ridge of a buried plank. Not old either, maybe a decade, maybe less. The stories in those notes weren't just echoes from the past. Something had been happening here long after the author stopped writing. And I was standing right on top of it. I cleared the dirt around the plank with my hands, pushing aside the loose soil until the wood's full outline emerged. It was rectangular, about 3 feet wide, and flush with the ground like the entrance to a root cellar. The grain of the wood looked newer than the barn itself, still solid despite the moisture. Someone had placed it here deliberately, not as debris, but as a cover. I wedged my spade under the edge and pried gently. The plank didn't budge. Whoever installed it had secured it well. I fetched a crowbar from the truck, slipped it underneath, and leaned my weight against it. With a sharp pop, one corner lifted, releasing a draft of cool, stale air from below. The opening revealed a narrow shaft, barely wide enough for a person to fit through, descending into darkness. Wooden rungs were nailed into the sides, forming a crude ladder. My flashlight beam caught glimpses of earth walls and what looked like wooden beams reinforcing the tunnel. My heart thudded in my chest. This wasn't just some animal burrow or forgotten root cellar. Someone had dug this intentionally and maintained it. I scanned the ground around the opening. The disturbed soil wasn't ancient. It was recent. For a moment, I considered calling someone, maybe even Mr. Carter, to ask what on earth this was. But the idea of him shrugging and brushing it off made my jaw tighten. No. This was my land now. And after everything I'd found, I needed to know what lay beneath it. I lowered my legs into the shaft slowly, testing each rung. They creaked, but held. I took one last look at the bright morning sky, exhaled, and started climbing down into the unknown. The air grew colder with each rung I descended, clinging to my skin like damp cloth. The smell changed too, less like earth, more like old machinery and oil. My flashlight's beam wavered against the earthen walls, revealing carefully dug tunnels, supported by wooden beams that were far too deliberate to be accidental. Whoever built this had known exactly what they were doing. When my boots finally touched the ground, I found myself standing in a narrow passage, tall enough to walk upright but barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. The walls were reinforced with planks and beams that had aged but remained sturdy. A thin layer of moisture slicked the floor, and my footsteps echoed softly down the corridor. I turned left, following the tunnel deeper. The air grew stiller the farther I went, like stepping into a sealed box. After about 20 yards, the passage opened into a small chamber. My light swept across shelves filled with dusty jars, stacks of wooden crates, and coils of wire. In one corner, a rusted metal generator squatted like a sleeping beast, its control panel covered in grime but intact. Someone had used this space for more than storage. Tables lined the walls, and on one of them lay scattered papers, brittle and water-stained but still legible. Diagrams of piping systems, sketches of machinery, and handwritten notes in that same looping script from the satchel. But what made my stomach tighten was the tunnel continuing beyond the chamber, darker and narrower, its floor sloping downward. I hesitated at the threshold, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in. Whatever this place had been, it wasn't abandoned by accident. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and took a step forward. The tunnel narrowed as I moved forward, forcing me to hunch slightly. The air grew cooler still, and droplets of water slid down the walls, catching the flashlight beam like tiny stars. My boots sank slightly into damp earth, each step accompanied by a soft squelch that echoed ahead of me. The downward slope made it feel as though I were descending into the lungs of the land itself. After maybe 50 feet, I noticed the tunnel construction change. The rough wooden beams gave way to something more deliberate. Brickwork. Arched walls, carefully mortared, framed the passage like an old railway tunnel. Whoever had built this wasn't improvising with farm tools anymore. This was professional. A low hum tickled the edge of my hearing. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the deeper I went, the more distinct it became. A mechanical thrum, steady and rhythmic, like a heartbeat behind a wall. Then I saw it. A set of iron doors embedded in the brick, streaked with rust, but still imposing. They stood about 7 feet tall, secured with a heavy latch and a chain that had fused into a single, corroded mass. The hum was louder here, vibrating faintly through the floor. I knelt, examined the chain, and noticed it had been cut once before. The marks were clean, recent compared to the rest of the tunnel's decay. Someone else had been here. The latch creaked when I tested it, and to my surprise, it shifted slightly. My pulse quickened. I slipped the crowbar from my belt and wedged it into the gap. Metal groaned. With one hard push, the doors shuddered open, sending a gust of stale, metallic air rushing past me. The flashlight beam spilled into a cavernous space beyond. The room beyond the iron doors was vast, much larger than anything I'd expected to find beneath a forgotten barn. My flashlight swept across high brick arches that disappeared into darkness, thick pipes running along the ceiling like veins through a giant's body. Dust drifted in the air, disturbed for the first time in who knows how long, swirling like pale smoke around me. Rows of metal tables stood arranged in neat lines, covered with tarps that had hardened with age. I walked to the nearest one and peeled the tarp back carefully. Underneath lay an array of mechanical parts, gears, valves, pressure gauges, and something that looked suspiciously like turbine blades. Each piece was tagged with faded labels, some handwritten, others typed in block letters. Against the far wall stood several large cylindrical tanks, their surfaces slick with condensation. My light caught stenciled letters across one, "Property of U.S. Govt. Restricted." The word sent a chill down my spine. I moved deeper into the chamber, the sound of my footsteps echoing like whispers. In the center of the room was a raised platform with railings, and at its base sat an old control console, banks of switches, dials, and indicator lights coated in grime, but still eerily intact. It looked like the nerve center of some forgotten experiment. Then I noticed something else. Fresh boot prints in the layer of dust leading up to the console. Not decades old, recent. Someone else had been down here, and not long ago. My stomach tightened as the mechanical hum I'd heard earlier pulsed faintly through the floor beneath me. Whatever this place had been built for, it wasn't entirely dead. I wasn't just uncovering history anymore. I was stepping into someone else's unfinished story. I crouched beside the boot prints, tracing their outlines in the dust. They were sharp, well-defined, and led in a looping path around the chamber before stopping near the control console. The tread pattern was modern, nothing like the old work boots buried in my barn. Whoever had come down here wore hiking or tactical boots, and judging by the crisp edges, it hadn't been more than a few days. My flashlight beam slid across the floor and caught something small glinting beneath one of the tables. I reached down and pulled it out. A disposable flashlight, black plastic, the kind you'd find at a hardware store. Its casing was scratched but intact, and when I clicked the button, it flickered weakly before dying. Someone had dropped it recently. The idea that I wasn't alone anymore tightened the air around me. I scanned the chamber slowly, half expecting to hear footsteps echo back from the tunnels. But only the steady hum remained, like a sleeping animal breathing beneath the floor. I approached the control console. Up close, I saw smudges on the dust-covered panels. Fingerprints. Someone had touched the switches. One lever was halfway between two positions, and several of the indicator lights, though dim, were faintly glowing. Power was still running somewhere down here. I followed the fresh boot prints toward the far side of the room. They stopped at a heavy maintenance door, the kind with a wheel handle like you'd see on a submarine. A single piece of paper was tucked under the wheel. I pulled it free and unfolded it carefully. It was a map. Not of the barn, but of the underground structure itself, drawn with precise lines and marked with red circles. One circle sat exactly where I stood. Another was deeper inside. I stared at the map, my heart hammering. The red circle deeper inside wasn't just a random mark. It was labeled in neat block letters. Core Chamber. Arrows traced a route from the maintenance door straight to that location, winding through a series of narrow tunnels. Whoever left this map had a plan, and I had just stepped into the middle of it. I turned the wheel handle on the maintenance door. It groaned but moved, flakes of rust falling like old snow. Beyond lay another tunnel, narrower than the previous ones, its walls lined with corroded pipes and faded warning signs. The hum grew louder here, no longer just a background vibration, but a distinct rhythmic pulse, mechanical, yet almost alive. I followed the map carefully, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air grew warmer as I went, thick with a metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. At one point, I passed a junction where another set of boot prints branched off to the left, disappearing into a side passage. For a moment, I hesitated. Someone could still be down here, but curiosity won. I continued toward the core chamber, the walls closing in around me as if the earth itself wanted to keep its secrets buried. Eventually, the tunnel widened into a circular room lined with steel panels. In the center stood a massive cylindrical machine, humming with a low, steady energy. Thick cables snaked from its base into the floor, and a single control terminal stood nearby, its screen faintly glowing green. I stepped closer, my breath catching. The machine wasn't abandoned. It was active. And judging by the freshly disturbed dust around the terminal, I wasn't the first one to find it. Someone had been here. Recently. I circled the massive machine slowly, every step crunching through decades of dust, except where fresh footprints had already carved a path. Whoever had been here had approached the terminal, interacted with it, and then vanished back through the tunnels. The green glow from the screen pulsed softly, casting eerie reflections on the steel walls. It wasn't a random relic. This thing was alive, waiting. I wiped the dust off the terminal and scanned the interface. The screen displayed a series of status readouts, most marked "Standby" in faded text, but one section caught my eye. Auxiliary power, active. A timer beneath it counted upward, suggesting that someone had reactivated this system recently. Next to the console, a small metal panel lay ajar. Inside it, I found a folded document protected in a plastic sleeve. My hands shook as I opened it. It was a declassified government memorandum dated 1952. The project's name was stamped at the top in bold letters, Project Wellspring. The memo detailed the construction of an underground experimental energy system, designed to harness groundwater pressure to generate continuous mechanical power. The barn above had been chosen as one of several remote sites. When the program was abandoned, equipment was left in place, buried and forgotten. Or so they thought. I stepped back, looking at the humming core. Someone had found this before me. Someone had started it again, and they might return at any moment. I turned off my flashlight, letting the green glow bathe the chamber, and realized I was standing at the intersection of history and mystery, an accidental buyer of a barn sitting on top of a secret decades in the making. Thank you for listening to my story. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and don't forget to subscribe for more.